Welcome, everybody. We are here in Washington, D.C., the day after the Bitcoin Policy Summit, the third Bitcoin Policy Summit. I'm Frank Corva, the political correspondent for Bitcoin Magazine, and I'm joined by the co-founder of the Bitcoin Policy Institute, David Zell. David, welcome.
Thank you.
Super excited to have you with us here. I want to sort of maybe bring the audience up to speed. So the first ever Bitcoin Policy Summit was 2023, not long after the Bitcoin Policy Institute was founded. We were still in a bear market back then. Maybe people weren't as interested, politicians weren't as interested in learning about Bitcoin. We had a different administration, the Biden administration. Things were a lot different this year. Can you sort of take us across that 2-year time span of from the first conference to this one?
Yeah, we started BPI in January of 2022. Our goal was to produce research on Bitcoin and its relationship to the United States. You know, our sort of core ethos and belief is that both America and Bitcoin are, necessary for global freedom and human flourishing. And so we wanted to sort of present this case to the world, but in particular to policymakers, that the success of Bitcoin need not come at the expense of the United States, but that instead the success of Bitcoin would empower the United States. And because of the properties of the protocol and the network, its success would actually help achieve many of our country's stated goals, like promoting free speech, property rights, open capital markets, and the right to transact. For a while, we were basically a blog with no political influence and no one really reading our blogs. And then, a few months into doing this, we start a very bad bear market. FTX, whose CEO, Sam Bankman-Fried, had been sort of dominating the conversation in Washington, kind of took down the reputation of digital assets broadly with it. Like, there was a bear market in price, and there was also a bear market in prestige and influence. We thought that this was an opportunity because another core objective of the Policy Institute was to sort of draw a clear distinction between Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. Every other organization in DC, it was focused on, crypto, on blockchain, on digital assets. My view has always been that that term is so broad that it makes conversation difficult, right? Are you talking about fartcoin? Are you talking about DeFi? Are you talking about stable coins, meme coins? And so for us, we have this exclusive laser focus on Bitcoin. So we were a very small nonprofit. We had basically no money. We had 3 months of runway before the organization ran out of funds. And so Grant and I made the decision to die quickly rather than slowly. So we spent all of our money, it was like $50,000, on a conference in the middle of this bear market to sort of make those arguments to the policy community that Bitcoin is good for America, that it's fundamentally distinct from crypto, and that it wasn't going away. That people had, what's the Mark Twain line of like, rumors of Bitcoin's death had been greatly exaggerated. I think the price of Bitcoin at the first summit was like $27,000. And we had about 200 people there. The following year, in 2024, our policy summit had a slightly different focus, right? Bitcoin had started to come out of that bear market. BlackRock had just announced the ETF. And so the theme of that event was really focused less on making the case that Bitcoin isn't going away, but on making the case that Bitcoin is very aligned with the interests of the United States. Then, after the election, the president signed an executive order essentially codifying all of the things that I just said as the policy of the White House, that Bitcoin is distinct among digital assets, that it is a strategic imperative for the United States to embrace it, and that it's certainly not going away, so much so that we should actually get some in case it catches on. And so, that was a wild thing to see, the executive order in March. And so this year's event the theme was sort of, now what? Okay, the White House likes Bitcoin. The crypto industry spent record-breaking amounts of money in DC, which means that it's not nearly as hard as it once was to get people to talk with you about Bitcoin. Like in the early days, we would sort of beg for a meeting and we'd be given a sort of like a summer intern as like okay, you can go talk with this 19-year-old who's going to be on their phone. Now it's like 2 weeks ago, we did an event on Capitol Hill and there were like 20 legislative directors there. And I spoke with a bunch of these people in the audience that day, and they all said it was because of the J.D. Vance speech. Bitcoin Vegas 2025, J.D. Vance gave a speech about Bitcoin, and toward the end of that speech, he started talking about it as this issue set in relation to China, national security, sort of the geoeconomic monetary order stuff, and he sort of name-dropped BPI as kind of the leading voice on these issues. So I think all of these trends coalesced in the event yesterday. We had nearly 1,000 registrants. I don't know if that many people were there, but it was certainly north of 600 or 700. And the quality of programming and the size of the event have basically just, kept pace with Bitcoin. And so it was a really eclectic group. There were Bitcoin core developers, technical experts, human rights activists, politicians, policymakers, agency employees, White House officials, and just Bitcoiners, running and working at some of the most influential companies, both here in the States and abroad. And that's kind of the vision of BPI, is sort of put all these people in a blender and, whatever the smoothie that comes out is this really interesting thing where, I talked to Shinobi about the conference and I was saying, what did you think? He said, it's really weird, man. I've never been to a conference where all these people are wearing suits. It was very formal. It was very stodgy. I talked to the government people and they're like, I've never been to a conference in DC that was this laid back and weird and cool. And so I think hearing that perspective that the DC people found it a bit offbeat and the Bitcoin people found it a bit formal made me feel like I had done my job well. So that's kind of a long answer to the question of how we started and why we started the organization. And I'm just tremendously proud of the team and grateful for the supporters that we have that have let us basically be a startup. We were not like most think tanks, like the ones you see in these big mansions across the street from us. Sure. They were started 60 years ago with endowments from some industrialist. We were two people writing a blog basically. And that just sort of shows the power of the Bitcoin community that has enabled us to open an office in DC, get a full-time staff, and throw really, really high-quality events with Bitcoiners, decision makers, and everybody in between.
Yeah. One thing, not only are you attracting a lot of people, but I feel like the people you attract, you also did another event, it was called Bitcoin for America. I think it was 2 or 3 months ago.
Right.
And what I took away from that as someone that goes to a lot of conferences was people bringing their A-game presentation. You had a great talk from Andrew Hones, Michael Saylor, Vivek Ramaswamy, all really, really good talks, very pointed, very focused, talking to their area of specialty, really, really great content, if you will, just great rhetoric. So when it comes to this and people bringing their A game to this, what is it that has shifted? Is it just the fact that now, because the Trump administration is sort of friendly to it, people want to have their moment in the spotlight talking about it? Is it that certain people really did care about Bitcoin, but the Overton window hadn't shifted enough? And then let's start there. I have a follow-up too, though.
Yeah, I think it's a mix of everything, right? I think that when the president. I think what I've found since starting BPI is that there are Bitcoiners everywhere in bizarre places. And when the United States is, anti-Bitcoin, the incentive as a civil servant or a bureaucrat is to not bring up your autistic special interest, your special interest, right? When the president of the United States says that it's the policy of his administration to make America the Bitcoin capital of the world, well, most people are looking around being like, well, how the hell do we do that? Maybe there's a guy or a woman in an office who says, oh, well, I can talk about Bitcoin now. And not only is it not a career risk, it's a career asset. So I think it has motivated some policy entrepreneurship. It's definitely emboldened people, until, circumstances and, with everything going on in the Middle East. We were supposed to have the deputy director of the CIA do a fireside with our executive director, Matt Pines. And to me, I was disappointed that didn't happen. I do think we will probably do an event centered around a conversation between those two in the future. I think it's a massive signal of how far this has come. DDCIA historically gives one public remark every year, every other year. It's usually at a think tank that's like a, you know, effectively so a long-standing institute like the Aspen Institute or whatever. So the fact that, until very recently before very shortly before the event took place, he was slated to speak was just an incredible signal. It's safe to talk about Bitcoin now. It's kind of fun for people to talk about now. And there's kind of career upside to navigating this well and being the person that can say, hey, I know how to, achieve the White House's objectives.
Yeah. One thing that's funny, you do sort of find that as being a journalist in this space, you sort of really come to see that the government is not a monolith. It's not like we all like Bitcoin or we all don't like Bitcoin, and then us versus them sort of dynamics that sometimes a lot of Bitcoiners on Twitter or X or whatever will sort of point it out. Why are we involved in the state? Why are we having these conversations? But one of the things I found really surprising is speaking with people in government, someone like Congressman Nick Begich, who was at the event yesterday, who spoke. Nick introduced the Bitcoin Act to the House, which is, I think, the sister act to the act that the bill that Senator Lummis introduced in the Senate. Nick Begich has been buying Bitcoin since 2012 on Mt. Gox.
Yeah, he lost like a few hundred coins on Gox.
Yeah.
He's a real hoot. He's a really interesting guy.
Well, my question to you is sort of what other stories like that have you heard in getting to know people, in this world in DC? Have you heard other stories like this where they have been sort of, okay, yeah.
Yeah. Without naming names, I know that there are people. For example, there's a guy who until recently had a very high up role at a very prestigious and old think tank in DC. Guy did sort of AI tech competition work. And he told me he ran a node in his basement. I think he ran 2 of them, but never talked about Bitcoin until he did a BPI, sort of met some BPI people, and you sort of talk, and it's like, okay, no one's listening. Like, I'm with the Bitcoiners. I've got an umbrel. I run a node. So I think stuff like that is just not uncommon.
Yeah.
And you're certainly right too that the state is not a monolith. I think we have a tendency to anthropomorphize systems, and we refer to the United States government as just this singular entity. And the truth is, it's like thousands of people, in this kind of complex sort of power hierarchy. Each of them have a sort of different objective set and responsibility and sort of authority to make decisions within those responsibility areas to achieve those objectives. So yeah, I think that's an astute observation. And to the point of why bother talking to the government? Yeah, I mean, our policy has always been an open door policy, that we will talk to anyone who wants to talk to us about Bitcoin. And I think you saw that reflected, there at the event yesterday. There were plenty of people there who were not into Bitcoin, who were skeptical of it. And that's something I'm extremely proud of, is most Bitcoin conferences that I go to they're for the true believers and for the Bitcoiners. I think BPI's events, at least we try to make them explicitly geared toward people who are not Bitcoiners. And DC is just a town where, by virtue of the of politics, people don't agree. And so I have never been one to particularly enjoy just only hanging out with, associating with, speaking with people with whom I agree. To me, it's a real treat to talk to people who don't share my beliefs. And then the nice thing is when you run a think tank, you get to sit someone down in a chair and then, inundate them with 8 hours of curated content to try to, maybe change their mind a bit.
Yeah.
So that's also just like a real treat to get to do that. And the conversations that happen, and you see the sort of new ideas form. So many people told me, for example, that they had never thought about Bitcoin as, a human rights tool. They're dollar users, and Apple Pay works well. And, when Alex Gladstein gets up on stage and, reminds people that only 13% of the world have the privilege of using a reserve currency or a very strong, stable currency, and do so in a jurisdiction that has civil liberties and free speech and property rights. It's eye-opening, right? Because for a lot of people who attend our events who are DC sort of policy people, they see Bitcoin as, something that maybe alternative asset people or, alternative asset managers are buying, and Larry Fink. They see tech bros speculating on some trinket. And then when you see research presented from Cornell University at our stage that shows that, internationally, the things that track most closely or correlate most closely with Bitcoin ownership in a country are whether that country is an authoritarian regime, basically, or whether they have a currency that is devaluing at a double or triple digit rate. So it's stuff like that. It was really cool because I think everyone in Bitcoin knows Alex and HRF. Not everybody in DC has heard the human rights side of Bitcoin. So being able to platform and kind of interchange academics, people from the White House, people from the Senate, human rights activists, core developers. Yeah, I think it was eye-opening for people that don't know much about Bitcoin, and that's kind of the top line goal.
Yeah, appreciate that. Yeah, we all love to kind of preach to the choir and be with our own, if you will, but it really is exciting to see new voices coming into the fold, eyes opening, saying, "Oh, I didn't know this." Right? It really is a special thing to see up close. This is sort of indicated by the titles of the panels and the talks that were, that people gave yesterday. But what right now are the most pressing issues in the Bitcoin space as far as legislation that's currently working its way through the House and Senate?
Yeah, I think it depends on the perspective. So you can sort of look at this question two different ways. Like, what is dominating the conversation and the political capital and attention in DC presently? And what do we as, an organization really focused on Bitcoin prioritize? Right now, the biggest issues in DC are the market structure legislation and the stablecoin legislation, neither of which particularly relate much to Bitcoin, with the notable exception that the BRCA, which Matt Corallo, the 10th known Bitcoin core developer, did a talk on yesterday, and then was on a panel with two Democratic lawmakers who are sponsors or supporters of the legislation. That has now been added into the latest draft of the market structure bill. And I think that is something that Bitcoiners, BPI, we try to sort of pick our battles. We don't weigh in on the staking, on sort of ICO, on the crypto stuff. We try to be sort of judicious with our voice.
Could I ask a quick question there, if you don't mind? But you do. I just want to say this because I often write about it. You do have to pay attention to what's happening in the broader crypto legislation space, because Bitcoin will fall into that. Bitcoin is a crypto asset, and given that it might not be the Bitcoin Act or a specific Bitcoin bill, but you do have to pay attention to what's happening across the spectrum of crypto bills.
Absolutely, if not just because they can be opportunities to accomplish very awesome objectives. And got to give a huge shout out to the folks at Coin Center for their advocacy on the BRCA. It for those who don't know, is essentially a fix to one of the core problems with how crypto and Bitcoin are regulated in DC, which is the treatment of software developers, people who simply write code, as money service businesses or money transmitters. The laws that we have in the United States that govern finance are written with the embedded assumption that if you are going to transact, there will be an intermediary. Therefore, an entity that can know things about you, that can require you to tell it things about you, that is just not fit for purpose with peer-to-peer systems. And so we've seen that, best illustrated in the Tornado Cash case, in the Samurai Wallet case. In both instances, you have people who wrote software that enabled individuals to make transactions, and the software developers never took control of user funds. And so these laws are insidious because on the surface, especially to someone who doesn't understand how Bitcoin works, they might seem for a Washingtonian like quite sensible, right? Like, oh, we need to do AML, KYC. These aren't particularly onerous requirements to them. But it's not just that these are sort of strict regulations. They amount to sort of de facto bans when a software developer literally can't comply, even if they wanted to. So yeah, I think that's just a small example of, like we focus on Bitcoin. We don't ignore politics. We don't ignore the crypto policy world, because they're obviously, they're not completely, separated. And, and I think events like this can be really powerful. Like one of the announcements yesterday was that BRCA has a new Democratic, supporter in the House. The crypto policy stuff dominates the conversation in DC way more than the sort of Bitcoin focused stuff. But this was a huge theme of the event yesterday, this belief that we have that Bitcoin policy is not, it's not a subset of crypto policy. I think that is the dominant frame here, is that there's digital asset policy and there's these different digital assets. Bitcoin is one of them. So it's this subset of crypto policy. I think that that's an entirely incorrect view of things. I think, we don't have internet policy really per se. It's just that as the internet grew, it became a sort of hyper-relevant technology in every aspect of statecraft and of our lives. Like this, this increasing share of our political, our economic, our social life took place online. And, to properly have a conversation about, geopolitics, about national security, about the domestic defense industrial base, the innovation, everything. The internet touched everything, and it became so dominant that you can't have a conversation about any serious policy issue without understanding the internet.
Yep.
I think Bitcoin's the same way. It's going to rapidly eclipse, and I think we're already seeing this happen, the rest of crypto with respect to its strategic significance to the United States. And to me, Bitcoin policy is in large part reminding policymakers that the sort of pressing issues du jour are all impossible to properly assess and craft policy around without a sort of understanding of what Bitcoin is now and where it's very likely headed in the not so distant future.
So Bitcoin is sort of, we have to think about in terms of global politics, how we're sort of, what role it's going to play in that world. Bitcoin is also a global asset. And I think a lot of the world now is paying attention to what is happening in the United States. And often we know that legislation in the United States, regulation, will be copied and pasted globally. So I was just wondering, as a final question here, maybe a message to the world, people who are watching the Bitcoin Policy Summit happen in America. And I want to quote something you said at the Bitcoin for America event. You said, this is a Bitcoin for America event, but it is to send a signal to the rest of the world that this is a technology that we're embracing here in America and that people around the world should embrace. So just maybe a final thing for you to speak to, just what it means for the United States to lead when it comes to Bitcoin and Bitcoin legislation.
Yeah, I think there are two kind of components of this. They both have to do with just innovation. The first is the fact that many countries look to the United States and their policies when they decide how to craft their own. We remain, as a country, a leader, and a lot of countries take their cues from us. So if our policy is to embrace Bitcoin entrepreneurship and development and research, then it is much more likely that other nations will follow suit. Conversely, if we are harsh on Bitcoin, if we try to push development and research and entrepreneurship out of our country, and we do so with the law, it gives every other country the cover that they need to follow suit. So I think having a decisively pro-Bitcoin policy stance kind of has a signaling effect and a spillover effect on how other jurisdictions regulate the technology. The second component of this is that so much innovation happens in the United States. We have the deepest and most liquid capital markets in the world. And, pretty much every major technology innovation in the last few decades has come out of, New York or Silicon Valley. And so I think that if the United States, were to take a different approach, yes, other countries and jurisdictions would pick up the slack, but they would do so with far fewer resources. And without the sort of components of the United States that have really fostered innovation, right? The capital markets, the university system, the strong court system. So I think it would slow the pace down of Bitcoin investment, of development, of the proliferation of new technologies, products, and services. It's not that they would go away if America were to be hostile, but when we are decisively pro-Bitcoin, I think we sort of accelerate the timeline of Bitcoin's game theory, and the trajectory that we're on gets compressed considerably.
Yeah, well, I think it's a perfect place to end it. David, congratulations on the successful summit. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, we'll be in touch.